All right, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. This is Maria Failla, and you're listening to Your Superior Self.
Perfection, Maria. Thank you for taking the time. It's so nice to have a fellow podcaster on the show. How
It's
are you
always more
doing?
fun it's always more fun this way, right? When someone offline, the minute I hopped on, I was like, these are the three microphone issues I'm having. Let's troubleshoot. But only another podcaster will understand the grief that tech troubleshooting brings to most of these recordings.
Absolutely. Bloom and grow. I love that. Little backdrop back there. That's the name of your podcast, right?
Yeah, my whole brand, my whole business is Bloom and Grow LLC. And a fun story about that is before I've been a professional plant lady, I was a professional performer. And my name is Maria, and I grew up loving the show The Sound of Music. And then I got to tour. I did the I did the national Broadway tour of The Sound of Music in 2018. And
Mhm.
Edelweiss, Bloom and Grow Forever, that's a famous lyric in that song. Edelweiss has always been a very important song to me. My grandpa used to sing it to me. And so Bloom and Grow is, although a very planty, phrase, it's also a secret little nod to my other profession as a performer and one
Mhm.
of my favorite shows.
How'd you get into performing?
I came out of the womb singing. My mom says singing or screaming. I wanted to be a performer since, I could speak, since I knew what performing was. And I was that kind of annoying kid, the older sibling that would make all my younger siblings make plays with me. And, everybody would have dinner and then they would have to sit and watch me like sing and dance for, 15 minutes before everybody was, released from the dinner table. So always, I was a natural performer from the get-go, and always knew what I wanted to pursue. I went to school for it, and I was, a performer for until 2020.
Oh yeah. And then you had to make a transition then, right?
Yeah, well, I was in a show in New York City. I had actually booked my dream show in New York City that started rehearsals on May 7th, 2020. And the show ended up getting canceled 3 days before opening night because of the city mandates, the city shutdown.
Mhm.
So, for performers, obviously the pandemic was terrifying for everyone, but excuse me, for performers, live entertainers, um, we watched our careers evaporate, our industry evaporate in front of our eyes. It was
Mhm.
pretty wild. And I was super fortunate. A lot of my friends' side jobs as, being actors was working in restaurants, which also kind of evaporated. But I had been cultivating this little planty side hustle passion on the side. So I was very fortunate that I had something to transition into while the world kind of recuperated, because theater still isn't really, back to where it used to be.
Mm. Talk about that though, right? Like, so here you are at a crossroads of like not knowing. Like, I mean, you have a side hustle. Were you making money off the podcast then or the brand?
Well, it's been a multi-tiered growth process, I guess we can call it. I I created the Bloom and Grow Radio podcast, and that's the name of my podcast. It's a podcast where I help everyone care for plants successfully and cultivate more joy in their lives. It's primarily a plant care podcast. So I was a plant killer, and I couldn't keep a plant alive, if someone paid me. And when I moved in with my boyfriend, who's now my husband, I wanted to nest. And so I tried to care for plants one last time. But this time I wanted help. And so I turned to iTunes to try and find some houseplant care podcasts. And back in the day, 5 years ago, when I started this, there were no podcasts about houseplant care. And I was in Cats on Broadway at the time. So I was very happy with my career, but I decided to just make the podcast that I wanted to listen to because it wasn't available to me. And when my contract at Cats ended, I thought that I would just do 10 episodes of this idea that I had, Bloom and Grow Radio. Who was going to listen to that? A podcast about houseplant care. It like doesn't get more niche than that, right?
Hmm.
So um I kind of thought I would make 10 episodes. It would be just like a little passion project, a little love letter to houseplants, to fellow millennials, overstimulated millennials like me. And then that would be that, because I would, book my next show.
Mhm.
So I never, when I started Bloom and Grow, it was from a purely joyful place of service, really, just having some fun, trying to learn how to, I watched YouTube videos to teach me how to edit on GarageBand. I don't know how you started your podcast, but I
Same
was,
thing.
yeah,
Pat
totally.
Flynn, John Lee Dumas, all those guys.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Pat Flynn and John Lee Dumas has a great free podcast about how to start a podcast. But so yeah, so that's where Bloom and Grow started. And then I didn't book another Broadway show as quick as I thought I was going to. And the podcast downloads kept doubling. So I thought, okay, maybe I should keep following this. But then come, episode 20, I'm paying for this podcast out of my pocket, out of my savings. I'm now
Mhm.
unemployed because my show at Cats had closed. So my first goal was to just break even. So, the website cost $20 a month. So how could I make $20 a month with Bloom and Grow? And then some more expenses came. So okay, how do I make $50 a month? So I became an Amazon affiliate and a couple of affiliates for some other brands that I really liked. And then the goals just kind of kept getting higher and higher, just to kind of break even, and then ultimately maybe buy the plants that I wanted for my house, kind of fund my passion. And then yeah, and then in the last kind of year, the last 2 years, I've transitioned to trying to figure out how to make it my full-time job. But now it's much more than a podcast. There's a YouTube, there's social media, there's now a book. So there's a couple of, and I also have an online community platform. So we got a whole thing growing on right now.
Yeah. I mean, you talked about, before the show or before we started recording, you went from a 500 square foot apartment to now 5 acres, right? Like, I mean,
Yeah,
that's pretty impressive. Are you doing any forest bathing? I think that's
I
what they call it.
am.
I think
It
that's what
is
they
what
call
it,
it.
there's a whole chapter in my book, Growing Joy, about forest bathing. I It's a completely amazing practice with a lot of science behind it. So for those who might not know what forest bathing is, I know I'm one of your first planty guests. Forest bathing, the art of Shinrin Yoku, which is Japanese, or literally to bathe in the forest, is the practice of going into the forest for ideally 2 hours, but you can do it for as little as 20 minutes a day or 20 minutes at a time, and bathing your five senses in the forest. So
Mm.
allowing the forest to kind of wash over you. And this isn't running through the park with your, Snapchat open or your podcasts going. This is turning your phone off, putting it away, and letting yourself get in tune with the rhythm of nature and touching back, getting back into connection with awe, you know, um,
What do you
being in
feel? What do you feel when you do that? Right? Like, where do you go?
yeah, I mean, awe is really the more research I did for this book, which is all about how to use plants to lead a more joyful life. Um, there's interesting research and writings about awe for adults, because I think as kids, everything is awesome, but we're so stimulated and so excited by so many things. And then when you become an adult, like, you have to be a grown up and you can't get stimulated and excited like that. So I think letting myself really experience awe again for the first time, and also stillness.
Hmm.
I feel like it's almost like, I heard this once described by a horticulturist a long time ago, where, when you go into nature, it's like if you have a phone that has a million apps open, it's like clearing out all the apps, that closing out
Yeah.
the apps to kind of let the system run better.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's kind of like that. There's a sense in your nervous system, switching from that fight or flight that we end up being in our autonomic nervous system. We end up being in fight or flight a little too much with the 24/7 news cycle, and the emails and traffic and money problems and all this kind of stuff that as humans we're not really designed to deal with on a 24/7 basis. um, the forest, nature, spending time with even your houseplants lets you kind of go back to that rest and reset, you know, um, part of your body, which is
Hmm.
really healing and really restorative. And I don't think we spend enough time doing it. So anyway, that was a very long explanation, but
I love it.
what I, what I found, and I have a whole chapter in my book about how forest bathing was actually a huge part of coping with my depression after losing my job in the pandemic, because I walked through the same trail in a forest, 3 to 4 times a week through 3 seasons. And it helped me internalize the passing of time because I saw, the seasons change. And it helped me kind of just get quiet with my thoughts. And some days, I left my tears in the forest, and some days I left my joy in the forest. But it was this like really healing space for me. And I think the forest just kind of gives you that space to kind of be with yourself and your feelings that you don't
Mm.
necessarily get to feel when you're just scrolling TikTok all the time, because
Yeah.
TikTok is so darn fun, but it's so distracting.
I can't like my wife is on it all the time just for like cooking stuff and like weird things around the house. But I get it, right? There's literature out there, research, the more that we're on our technology, the less we are connected to Mother Earth and plants and forests and our external environment.
And
I don't,
ourselves, right?
yeah,
Because
yeah.
another thing I talk about in my book, you know, the thing I say is, and this is like the biggest thing that I preach. So I'll tell you on the podcast, I won't make you buy the book because I truly want everyone to do this practice, but there's plenty of other ones for those who like where this resonates. But I say, look at a plant before you look at a screen in the morning,
Hmm.
because I think so this was my personal experience. I was living in 500 square feet in New York City, an incredibly overstimulated millennial. Every minute of my day was scheduled. And when I wasn't scheduled, I was binging Netflix or I was scrolling Instagram. So I would wake up and I would have coffee with my phone in the morning. And I would drink my coffee and I would scroll Instagram and I would watch YouTube videos. And I essentially like gave away my agency from minute one of my day, right? Like I gave myself no space for creative thoughts or individual unique thoughts, because
Yeah.
I was just looking at, cooking videos, I love those cooking videos, those YouTube videos. And when I started caring for plants, when I moved out of being a plant killer and into a plant lady, and I had a little thriving herb garden and I had some houseplants, all of a sudden I noticed that I wanted to have coffee with my plants in the morning instead of my phone. And I would leave my phone in the charger and I would go sit with my herbs and I would stimulate my five senses. I would, smell a basil leaf. I would watch dewdrop off of a chive. I would journal. I would do a gratitude journal, or I would just sit and enjoy these plants. And in isolating myself from my phone with my plants, I was able to kind of get reacquainted with myself.
Hmm.
So there is that kind of, when you allow yourself to be in nature or to be with nature or to be with plants, because I think concepts like forest bathing can be really intimidating to people, especially if you live in an urban environment where you think, well, I can't go to a forest. I don't have 2 hours to go do that. You can do it with one plant on your windowsill,
Mm.
but there's a real power in granting yourself the space to be with yourself and let nature help you reacquaint yourself with yourself, if that makes sense.
I love that. No, it's like it's twofold, right? Because you're getting to know yourself, but you're also, we talked about this pre-interview, right? Like I believe that all plants have their own consciousness and they interact with us, right? Like, so you're interacting with this plant and you're building a relationship, and people are probably like, what are you talking about? But all beings of, conscious, this rock has some form of consciousness to it. I mean, I, I'm not going to get into the physicist point of view about energy, but I believe that even plants have consciousness, and like what you were doing, that form of forest bathing with those plants, is you're building a relationship not only with yourself but with those plants. What?
Absolutely. And I say all the time, your plants are an external reflection of your internal world. When you're doing well, when you're happy, your plants tend to be happy, And when you're
But isn't that
struggling,
isn't that everything in your life though? Like, even like,
yeah,
I feel like like your external reality is just a mirror of what's really going on inside.
absolutely. Absolutely.
I mean, you
Definitely.
were experiencing death with all the plants, right? Like, how did you, like, internally, like, if you turn the mirror around and you see Maria, like, what was going on in your life that resembled that death?
Totally. Well, I also think it's about your mentality as well, right? Because when I was a plant killer, I think that's what you're referencing.
Yeah.
I made it so personal about myself. I carried so much shame. I would go to parties where my friends had plants that looked really good, and I would be like, man, I can't do that. And I would crack a joke about it to cover my shame, but I would make it mean something about myself. I mean, I labeled myself a killer. That's great. That's a lot. Um, and once I learned how to care for plants, it was so empowering, and it really made me change my own view of myself because it was something I was able to overcome, right? It was a new skill that I got to learn. And as adults, it's really easy not to learn new skills anymore.
Mhm.
It's really easy to just stay in your little
Stagnant.
bubble and to
Yeah.
stay stagnant. And the cool thing about plants as a hobby is it doesn't matter how many books you read, it doesn't matter how many courses there is always a different plant to learn about. You are never going to run out of plants, plant care practices, different types of growing, indoor plants versus outdoor plants. I was, for the first 4 years, primarily a houseplant parent because I was living in 500 square feet in New York. Now I live on 5 acres. All of a sudden, I can garden outdoors, and I'm learning all of these different new plant species and delighting in blooms. All the outdoor plants bloom, not and indoor plants, tropical plants don't tend to bloom as much. So, um, but yeah, it's very interesting. And I think also I see life lessons in plants a lot. Plants can be incredible teachers if you kind of tune yourself to their frequency. 100%, they're here to teach us.
What did they teach you though? Like, what was the number one lesson that you learned through your relationship with your plants?
Can I give you two? Picking
Sure.
one is really hard.
Give me two.
Yeah, well, I think with the okay, so here's the biggest one. Here's my life thesis one that I really experienced in the pandemic. So with plants, when let's take basil for example, because I feel like a lot of people try and grow basil at some point in their life. Number one, if you're going to grow basil, you need 8 hours of sunlight, and you need well draining soil, and you need to put it in potting mix in a um, pot if you're going to do it that way. But you can go listen to my podcast to learn how to care for basil because we're talking about the spiritual stuff here. So, when you prune basil, you cut off the top of the plant, but there's a hormone in the plant called auxin that is regulated by the tip of the plant. And when you prune it, so you cut it back, make it smaller, remove something, that actually triggers a hormone to get released in the plant that instigates new growth. So if you're a gardener, you know that, if your basil is getting leggy, or if you want more basil, you need to be routinely pruning it because it's going to cause a bushier, healthier, more robust plant. So pruning is a very interesting concept. It's a very helpful concept for gardeners to understand. If you prune, a flower, you're going to get two blooms later. But, you know, for your life, that is an incredibly powerful thought.
Mhm.
And in 2020, when I lost my job, I moved out of my apartment. I moved back in with my parents with my fiance for 6 months, which was quite an interesting experience. Um, yeah, we moved, and my wedding. I was a COVID bride, so my wedding had to get canceled. So in one, 6 month period, it felt like everything was pruned away from my life, right? All of the seemingly big things, career, home, wedding. But I just kept telling myself, after pruning comes new growth. After
Mm.
pruning comes new growth. Okay, Maria, this hurts. This is struggling, but like, what does basil teach you? Something good is coming. And there's a lot of struggle, in that year, but a book came out of it, right? I get to live in the most unbelievable, we manifested this insane house that we get to live in that is like too good to be true. We pinch ourselves every day when we're here, which we would have never been living in if we had stayed scared to live in New York City, right? There were
Mhm.
all of these, um, there were all of these things. There's all of this, quote unquote growth that's happened from the pruning that happened in my life. So I think pruning is overall definitely like the most powerful lesson that I've learned from plants.
You need to make a T-shirt that says, "What did basil teach you?"
Yeah, totally. What did basil teach you? Or just be the basil, prune the
be the
basil.
be the basil.
Yeah, be the basil man.
Manifesting your home. Um, talk about that, right? Like, what did that look like for you?
Well, we had a lot of uncertainty in our life last year. We ended up moving 3 times. We had several homes fall out of we had several homes not work out due to like tons of unforeseen circumstances. We just kind of got bad luck last year. And I we were in a position where um we had to find a new house quickly and in the peak season of a rental season where we were living. So there were like no options. There was nothing on the market. And it was really scary and stressful. There was a lot of stuff going on in our lives. We did not have a lot of time to prep to go, apartment hunting. And I just got quiet with myself and thought this is going to work out, like this or something better, this or something better. And I got this intuitive hit to post on this app that on Upstate Curious, shout out. It's an app that people in the Catskills use to communicate with each other. And I posted a photo of me and my husband saying, "Hey, does anybody want to be our landlord? We got a crazy, we're in this crazy situation. Here's our budget. This is what we need. We're really nice. We have good credit. We don't have any pets. Like, does anybody want to, rent to us?" And this woman reached out to us out of, from this app and offered us her very fancy house for the budget that we had. And, I'm gardening for her. So I've put in garden beds and it's been like the most amazing experience ever. Um, but it's interesting. I do feel like when you ask for stuff, the universe sometimes tests you a little bit to see if you really want it. And it wasn't necessarily like the easiest manifestation. There were like a lot of bumps. There was a lot of pain. We moved right in the beginning of the winter. So, the winter for us was really hard living in the middle of nowhere, not knowing anyone. But it was like we had to kind of endure that before we got to enjoy this beautiful spring that we've been enjoying. Like I literally just spent 30 minutes on my balcony, like
Mm.
playing with hummingbirds that are my friends
Playing with
now.
hummingbirds.
I have this
Oh,
hummingbird feeder that I just like hold and the hummingbirds come and drink out of my hand. It's
that has to be
so
like an
fun.
omen or something. You know what I mean? Like that has to
It's
be like,
so cool. It's so fun.
but talk about that, right? Like you said, a lot of bad luck, right? Like, how do you keep that perseverance going? Like I run into it in my life too, right? Like I just, I just happen to be a person that has a strong sense of perseverance. Like I know, I have this, you talked about that gut instinct, that intuition, that if I just keep doing this thing, I don't know what it looks like. I don't know what the results will be, but I know that something good will come out of this. Like for you, Maria, like what did you do? Or, was it the mindset of, what did Basil teach you? Or was it more or less like you just had this intuitive knowing that things would work out?
Yeah, there's a word I use the word intuitive whisper a lot. Um the biggest intuitive whisper I've ever gotten actually was to start Bloom and Grow Radio, my podcast, because everything on the external was telling me not to do it. I had my job
Really?
on Broadway. I wasn't into plants. And, my friends were being like, "Why would you start a podcast about houseplants? You should be focusing on your performing career. Like, this doesn't make any sense. Why are you wasting your time? No one is going to listen to a show about houseplants that's so weird and niche. Like, you're going to be over this. This is just a phase. You're going to be over this hobby in a minute, blah, blah, blah." But there was just this inner knowing that was like, you have to do this.
Mm.
And I definitely have a personality that hyperfixates for sure. I'm an Aries, but I don't know. There was just something in me, and I'm fortunate that once again, though, I was getting quiet with plants. I was spending a lot of time with plants. I was creating that space for my inner wisdom to speak to me. Um, I think it's really easy for us to block out our intuition these days because we just self-soothe with all of these external factors. And I know because I'm guilty of it, right? I
Mhm.
struggle with screen addiction as much as anyone else does, even though I write about looking at a plant before you look at a screen. It's like I write about it because it's something I struggle with. And I know that those intuitive whispers that have changed my life only come when I clear space for them. And meditation, I have a love-hate relationship with it. It's a lot easier for me to get still with plants than to get still on a meditation pillow.
Sure. Well, that's the same
Um,
thing with me, right? Like, so meditation, it depends on the morning. It depends on, every meditation is not the same. And I think that that's how it's supposed to be. I think it's
mhm.
once you start trying really hard, the less likely you are to get into that space. So we do things, we have tools that help us. Yours is plants, mine is running. I do a lot, a ton of running, and it helps me get into that mindset
Oh, for
or
sure.
where I can connect with that part of myself that is of higher knowing or of higher knowledge, or that knows something that's going to be beneficial for me down the road that I can't see. But
I
the
get
fun,
so many aha moments in my workouts.
yeah, definitely, because you're going into this theta and alpha
Yeah,
mindsets.
totally, totally.
But I mean, going back to that point, is the more that you spend time there in those mind states and that and the brain waves, the more that, like, I don't want to call it psychic phenomena, but psychic phenomena starts to happen. You start getting this inner knowing, these intuitive voices that are pointing you into different directions and showing you that things are going to start working out. I mean, you have to do the work essentially, but once you start doing that work, you start having more faith in this ability of knowing, because it starts unfolding in a way that is true for you, and you start experiencing reality as something much more greater than what we perceive it right now, right? Like the screens, right? There's something out there. I mean, I never really paid attention to it because I was so caught up with the external successes and external wants and external material things. And then when I started connecting with that inner part of myself, there's a whole nother world there that we're not really aware of because we're so busy living in the external with our five senses that we forget and we don't work that muscle that is intuitive inside of us.
Yeah. I think intuitive, yes. I wish I was just taking notes with what you just said because I feel like you said a bunch of really cool things. 100%. You got to connect with your intuition, right? I also think you have to, I think you made a really good point about having to look. You have to look for the signs that the universe are giving you, right? Sometimes. Um,
What signs do you get?
well, I just had this is a great example I'll share with my therapist that I had last week. Because once again, I'm a work in progress, just like anyone else's.
Oh, I love therapy. Don't hate
Yeah.
on therapy.
Oh, no, no, yeah. But I do find it ironic that I'm publishing a self-help book when I'm like, yeah, I'm still working through a lot of this anyway. But that's the beauty of this whole thing. Anyway, I was stressing out with my therapist about the fact that I had several things go haywire. My book launch got pushed back and I had to reschedule all sorts of launch parties that I had organized, and it was a very stressful week. I was supposed to travel, and in my body I knew I could not travel that weekend. I knew that I needed to stay home and be with my plants and decompress and settle. And I had this uneasy feeling about this travel that I had to do that weekend. And I had a big delivery. I had to shoot a bunch of content and I had a big delivery that wasn't able to be delivered. And so it made my stress even higher because it basically was going to make me have to do a lot of work right before I had to travel. And ultimately actually un- made it unable for me to travel that weekend. And I had all this stress about it. And my therapist was like, or that was the universe messing with your delivery in order to open space for you to not travel, you knucklehead, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
And in that moment, I'm like, oh, right. I was so wrapped up in my shit that I wasn't even able to take that note from the universe and that late delivery. But I also think that's a big perspective thing, right?
Mhm.
Because um, every moment of our lives, and I'm realizing this now too, as I'm a full time entrepreneur. Here's a secret about entrepreneurship no one tells you: it's awful. Like, it's fantastic. It's fantastic. I wouldn't do anything else. I feel so lit up by how I get to help everyone. It is the hardest thing ever, and it is the most glamorized thing. Like, everybody in the United States wants to be an entrepreneur and make, $20,000 a month, whatever, but everybody on TikTok is talking about. It is the most vulnerable, hard, scary thing that you'll do, right?
Mhm.
Um, and I'm sure, you understand, right? And I feel like entrepreneurs don't talk about that. Um, and what I'm learning with entrepreneurship is you get to choose your mentality and your approach in every single moment. Every single moment you get to say, is this a problem or is this just an opportunity for me to find a solution? You know? Um,
Yeah. I mean, when I started the podcast, I probably started the podcast right around the same time you did. like 4 or 5 years ago.
Hmm.
The buzzword was entrepreneur, right? Gary V and all of that.
Tim Ferriss, Pat
Tim Ferriss.
Flynn. Yeah.
4 hour work week. I mean,
Shout out. Yeah, exactly.
so I mean, I get that. I just think now it's the way that the work world is going, especially in business, right? Like, especially for managers, right? Like, so the thing that I'm seeing, the commonality is like, even managers, even entrepreneurs, like, you need to take a step back and stop managing the work that needs to be done and manage the well-being of the doer, right? Like, as a
Totally.
as
Oh
a
my God. Yes.
I mean, because that's a part of it now. It's the pandemic has showed us that our well-being is very important to us. That 5-day work week, hopefully it's gone. Like, I don't want to see 5 days ever again, right? Because
Well,
go ahead.
oh, I was just gonna say, that's very interesting because I was living Jess Lively. Do you know her? Did you ever listen to her
Mm-mm,
podcast?
no.
Great podcast, all about consciousness, very similar to your vibe. Um, and from the beginning of when I started Bloom and Grow, I really try to take action from an inspired place. And if I'm not in an inspired, positive place, I try not to take action when I don't have to. Because I feel like there's so much power in literally an email. Like, it's something small, a little thing, but I sometimes will wait an extra 24 hours to send an email until I'm in a great headspace before I send it, because I do feel like there is an energetic transaction with business. And I've noticed direct reflections of when I take action from a positive place and what I get back versus when I take action from a scared, angry, or fearful place and what I get back.
Hmm.
And now, with a couple years under my belt, I have enough source material to really, when I do the mental work, it shows up in my business. And when I am terrified, it shows up, you
Yeah.
know,
What you put out there comes back.
100%, 100% in a tangible way. That's the exciting thing about podcasts like yours and, Joe Dispenza and all of these wonderful people who are really doing the research and the science to start to really prove the power of mindset, man.
Yes,
It's
absolutely.
so awesome.
100%.
Yeah.
Like, there's a Paul Selig, who is one of my favorite
Yeah.
authors. He's from New York.
Yeah. He's great.
He says, what you damns you back. And it took me a
Hmm.
while to understand that. Like, what do you mean? And I had to learn it the hard way. And it was my mindset, especially in business. And, looking at it from a, white knuckle viewpoint of, I have to do everything on my own. And if I don't do it, it's not going to be done correctly. Um, that was showing up in my life, every area of my life.
And then
And
everything becomes hard, right? Because you
yes,
expect it to be hard. Yeah.
yes, absolutely. And then when you can step back, and it's hard to be, it's very hard to be. I'm a doer, and it's very hard to be. But once you become that that example of equanimity is the word I guess I want to use. Once you can be that in that space and not do, you start seeing other areas of your life fall into that ease and flow of just
Yeah.
like beautiful art, of just things are working, and you're not trying to control it. And sometimes it's bad and sometimes it's good, but then you realize, like, what really is good or bad. It's just an experience.
Yeah.
I don't
And
know.
you got one life, right? That's the
Yeah.
other
I
thing.
don't know. Do we have one life?
Right. Well, that's interesting. That's an interesting point. The
I
one
mean,
that we're here, the one that we're here doing.
look, we're like plants, right? Like, plants don't have just one life.
Well, we set seeds. Exactly. Well, I was going to, what you just said brought up another plant parallel I wanted to throw at you. So one of my other most powerful plant life parallels, right when I was starting out as a plant killer turn plant lady, I had a little pot of herbs on my balcony. In one pot, I had chives, basil, oregano, thyme, and sage. Have you grown any of these plants? Are you a gardener at all?
I wish I was. No, I'm
Okay,
not.
that's fine. You don't need to be. It's okay. Um, so in this one pot, I was growing all these plants. I was watering them all the same, right? Because they're in the same pot. But when I was a performer, I was really struggling with comparing myself to everybody else around me. Oh, this person got on Broadway before I did. Why did she get that audition and I didn't? I should be this much farther, right? It's this mentality, this mindset, what you were talking about with your old job, of that like kind of grippy place. And then I started like, after I spent a real season with these herbs, I noticed, wow, basil is this like slow and steady grower, but it's going to catch up. All of a sudden, it's going to be the biggest star of that container, but it starts up as this tiny plant, and you blink your eyes, and it's just this slow and steady thing that transforms in front of your eyes. Sage is a slow grower, but it's hardy. Can I curse?
Yeah.
It's hardy as fuck. Like sage will withstand frost, so even though sage might not be the star in summer the way basil is, sage like plays the long game, and
Hmm.
sage is going to be there, when all the other plants die back and it's Thanksgiving, and you're going to be able to really highlight it then. Thyme, has strength in numbers with all of these tiny delicate leaves, and it kind of crawls and spreads in a different way, and it takes up space in a different way that these other two plants do. And chives are these like weird, spiky headed, just like straight shooters, like no nonsense things. So in this one pot, and my book, I say it's like potted humanity. You have all of these different archetypes of people.
Yeah.
Um, and they don't give a shit about each other, right? They're all growing exactly the way nature intended them to. And they're all doing great. They're all thriving. We're reaping tons of harvests of all of these herbs. They're all doing great, and none of them are trying to grow in the patterns of the other ones, right? So that's a mentality thing. We can choose to waste our time thinking about all the other people in our life and how we should be and what we deserve, or we could just be and grow the way we're intended to, and then celebrate all the other people in our pot. There's
Yeah.
those are two different choices.
Yeah. I mean, I'm right there with you. Like, I was listening to this something, I don't know what it was. I'm so bad at this because I listen to so many different Audible authors that they all blend together at some point. But I think it was Thich Nhat Hanh. He said there was a parable in there, with a Buddhist parable, where a teacher asked students, how long is a lifespan, and or how long is life, and one said 80 years, one said like, I don't know, 30 years, and then one of them said um, the length of a breath.
Mm,
And I was like, length of a breath. And then they went a little bit further of saying that everything's anew in every moment, right? Like when you're living in the moment, and you
yeah,
take a breath in and a breath out,
that's it.
it's new.
Yeah,
And
that's it.
it's all about your mindset and how if you're living in the future, if you're living in the past, that's where all the suffering is, because you can't control the future, you can't control the past, you can only control how you're perceiving the moment. And if you're fully in the moment, there is no, and I say this, right, just like you with the self-help stuff, right? Like you talk about, screen time and your addiction to that. And I think we all battle that addiction. I battle being in the moment because there's so many distractions that catch my eye, especially with work, especially with the podcast, especially with kids and a wife and life. I forget to live in the moment. And, I have to do little reminders. Like, I carry this rock with me that we found at the beach. I mess around with my ring on my finger. I mess with my watch, and I try to remember to be in the moment, because when I'm in the moment, like, that's where I'm in touch with my entire being, with everything that I am. And I can kind of step out of that play that you're so accustomed to being in, right?
Hmm. You have
In
kids
this
though. The
musical.
kids are great teachers for how to be in the moment.
They are just so, they're like little monks is what they
Yeah,
are. They're like little monks with attitudes,
yeah,
and
with
like
temper tantrums.
yeah, little greedy selfish monks. That's what they
Yeah,
are.
yeah. I
Because
did a
they'll
lot of
say
babysitting in New York City, so
because they'll say things, I mean, and I'm just like, whoa, like, seriously, that was some serious Buddhist mindset stuff right
yeah,
there. And
totally.
then they'll talk about how, then they'll just go on a rant about something else, cocoa melon or something. I don't know,
Hmm.
um, but going back to the plant talk, right? Like the plants just are what they are, and they don't worry about other aspects of different plants and what they're doing, right? Like in your life, how did you struggle with that? Did you struggle with that when you were in theater? Did you struggle with that with the podcast? Did you always compare yourself to other podcasters? Did you think that you had to be different, that you had to be, is this success for you?
Yeah, you know the Enneagram?
What's that?
The Enneagram?
No, what is that?
Oh, you gotta do it. It's fantastic. It's a fantastic tool. It's a personality test.
Mm,
But so those listening who know the Enneagram, I'm a type 3. So I've been a people pleaser since, I was born. So a big part of my personality and my shadow self is struggling with really caring about what other people think of me and where I fall in line with people. So even from high school, I was always really, really driven to be the best. And if I wasn't, then I wasn't good enough. And that was that. So that's definitely been part of my story since since I can remember. And definitely as a performer, performing is so hard. It's my passion, and I just love singing more than I love anything, but the business of performing is really stressful and competitive and mean and sick and uh filled with other really like hurt people. So um that definitely an environment for a lot of those parts of myself to kind of thrive when I wish they wouldn't have.
mm,
I wish I could have thrown some, weed killer on them or something. Um, and interestingly enough, once I started podcasting, which felt like the most authentic, organic thing I've ever done, like Bloom and Grow has truly been the most channeled isn't the right word because it's me. I'm not channeling something else, but it's been the most pure version of myself that I've
mm,
offered to the world, far beyond any type of, singing, performing thing I've ever done. Um, that's kind of when some of that went away. So interestingly enough, once I started living more authentically and I think more intuitively, right? Because this whole business has grown off of this intuitive whisper. Um, I was able to just kind of do my own thing because I was just so excited to do my own thing. I was just so excited to do what, my creativity was telling me to do. Now, granted, I've totally now that I've, made this a business and there are other influencers and podcasters in my space now, of course you get caught up with, comparison syndrome. But I will say, you know, I go back to my herb lesson. I really do think about my herbs. Like every time I get caught up with one of those things, I'm like, okay, Maria, be the basil, like
mm.
relax. They're a chive. It's okay. So um I will say I do practice what I preach in this book in terms of really trying to take those lessons and think about them because I don't know if your shadow sides ever go away. It's just that you get a better handle of them and you communicate with them better.
Sure. I think we just become more aware of them.
Yeah.
Like you said, right? Like you just kind of like know they're there or
You
you
note
see
it and
them.
then you can just release it.
Mhm. Yeah. The book though, right? Like you talked about that and how that was was it an intuitive hit, or was it kind of like the universe gave that to you and you manifested that? Like what did that look like for you?
Oh my God, the book was the most wild experience. We want to talk about the spirit. This is fun because I feel like I normally talk more about the plant stuff. So this is fun to talk about the spiritual stuff. Yeah, so when I lost my job as a performer, I cried, drinking wine in my bathtub for a couple of months. And then I was like, okay, Maria, like you've grieved. Let's take a breath and stop drinking Aperol spritzes and, like meditate and see what would this look like?
Hmm.
Is this a path we want to walk down? Taking Bloom and Grow full time. And once I started living in that space, literally out of nowhere, I got this message from my now editor saying, hey, I work for this wellness imprint. I listen to your podcast. I know that you talk about plant life parallels in your podcast. Would you be interested in writing a book?
Wow.
So that was like a pretty crazy, that was the biggest note from the universe I think I've ever gotten, saying, okay, I hear you. And my interpretation of the universe is actually my ancestors. I think my grandparents are guiding me. I feel them all the time. And um, my grandma, they were all very, very passionate plant people,
Hmm.
even though I was very disconnected from it. So part of me just feels like I'm very much being guided by my grandparents right now. But
It's
yeah,
beautiful.
yeah. So that manifestation, whatever you want to call it, was a pretty kooky thing. And then the even kookier thing was I got on a call with Gwen, my editor, who's the sweetest person in the universe. We clicked immediately. I was like, I'm a podcaster, I'm a talker. I never really thought I would write a book. What would this look like? And she was like, let's talk about it. She said, take some time. If you want to pursue this, we would need to create a book proposal. It's going to be like 7 to 10 pages. This is what it would need. You're going to have to think about it. It's going to take a minute to like put together. And then I had the entire book proposal in 48 hours. It like, I like vomited it. It came out that if I was ever to channel something, it was this book proposal. It was
Hmm.
crazy how one day I'd never had a book in me, and then the next day I had a book. Like it was really weird.
That is awesome.
Yeah, it was pretty cool.
What is the editor like? That's intimidating though, right? Like, cause you've never written a book before, right? Like you're a performer, like you said, you're a podcaster, you sing on stage, and then now you have to put all of that energy on paper. um
Yeah, it's
how
crazy.
did you got to channel that energy, but I feel like if you're really in tune with what it is that you're trying to do, like you get tap into that flow state and just things just go through your soul and just come out of you.
Truly. Truly.
Editor, right? Like, so does she edit your entire book or just the proposal?
So she worked with me on the proposal. I also got a book agent, which helped me like tune the proposal off from, kind of from a business perspective. But yeah, and then well, the funny part is with a book, you get through the finish line of getting the book deal, and then they kind of say, "Hey, see you in 3 months. Deliver us your first draft," and then you're just expected to write a book and have no one hold your hand. And then I was like, Glenn, I need my handheld. So I had to write it. I wasn't allowed to show it to her until my first draft was written because she made a very interesting point that as my editor, she only gets one chance to read it cover to cover with a fresh set of eyes. So it was me stumbling around a Google Doc, figuring out what this book was.
What
And
was the
I
biggest
had
challenge for you for writing that?
figuring out how to write, you
No.
know, casually. I had all these ideas of I was going to write from 9 to 11 in the morning. And then I realized it would take me 45 minutes to even drop into a flow state. So when 11 o'clock came around, I wasn't ready to be finished writing, but I had scheduled. So a lot of it was like the logistics of like, how do you write 80,000 words? It's not writing 1,000 words. It's not writing a blog post. It's how do you write this much? Um, so I think that was one of my hardest. I think the organization was the hardest part for me
Mhm.
because I'm not a writer, right?
Yeah.
Or I am a writer now, but like I wasn't when I started the book. And I probably in hindsight should have hired a writing coach, which I did not do. Um, I think that would have been really helpful. I think that would have saved me. But it was cool. I mean, then I would have moments like, I would drop into these flow states where I would write for 9 hours. And my
Wow.
sweet husband would just like come over with a plate of food for me. And I would be like, not even able to look at him and have to just keep writing. So it was definitely probably the hardest, but also most exhilarating thing I've ever done. Like when
Mm.
you drop into those flow states and you feel like you've been able to distill a version of your worldview on something. And for me, also the thought that my words might help people, because this is a book that's really the true mission of this book is everyone who reads it, I truly just hope I inspire like one more ounce of joy in their day-to-day life. That is the coolest idea. Like that is the coolest, that is the most, that got me out of bed,
Sure.
towards the end when I was getting close to my deadline, I was getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I would write from like 3:30 to 5:30 because it was quiet. Emails weren't coming in. I was doing all sorts of wild stuff just to like cross the finish line. Cause if anybody listening is about to start a book, I would definitely double the amount of time you think you need to write it. Cause that's probably the amount of time I needed.
So interesting because I'm writing a manuscript right now, just kind of like fiction, right? Like I love novels. Like my favorite author novel of all time is sitting right here. I keep it with me all the time. The Alchemist.
I was just gonna say your favorite book is The Alchemist, isn't it? I love that book so much. It's
Isn't
so funny. I was just thinking that it's time for me to reread it.
I listen to it, I read it, and it's just
Oh, it's so
I
good.
don't think we have enough fiction in our lives. Like I feel
Yeah.
like you talk about getting in these creative states. Like I've like in school, it's just been nonfiction. It's been research. It's been journal articles, and then to get back into those flow states or the creative mindset, like I have to read this stuff. Like this Alchemist, like it took him forever to sell these
I
copies,
know.
and now this is the 25th anniversary edition. So like, I mean,
And it's such a short book. I read it in 2 days. I read it actually funny enough, the week I got married, I brought it. It was a beach read. I brought it to read, and I couldn't put the book down. I mean, he not married, sorry, engaged. And my husband was like planning this big proposal, and I was like, no, I have to finish reading The Alchemist right now. And there's that amazing line, and I actually wanted to have it read at our wedding, and then we ended up going somewhere else. But when the first time he meets his love, and he talks
mm,
about looking in her eyes for the first time. Oh,
I
and
just
also, as we talk about omens, I mean, read that book anytime you need to learn how to reopen your eyes to look for universal signs. No one puts it better than him.
Oh, and he even talks like I've watched a lot of his YouTube like just stuff, just to like kind of get in that space of like what does it take to write fiction, and he's same thing. He's like I don't it's not like he logistically sets these things up. He just kind of sits down and writes, and it comes out, and it comes from a place like I've written things, and I'm sure you experience this in the book. You like for 9 hours straight, you get into these flow states. You sit back and you're like, where did this come from? Like I don't.
Oh, when I was rereading my audiobook, which was so fun. I'm so excited that I got to narrate my audiobook. It was one of the coolest experiences of my life. But I was reading lines being like, oh my God, I wrote this. This is wild. I wrote that line. That's a good line. That I wrote that. And then there were other lines where I was like, oh my God, this is terrible. How is this typo? How did the typo make it into the book? Like that kind of stuff too. But yeah, 100%. I 100% agree with you. And oh my gosh, I think we're going to sell more versions of The Alchemist with this episode than with my own book. But please, buy Growing Joy and The Alchemist together. They're two very different books.
I've enjoyed this conversation. It's gone by too quick. Maria, how can people connect with you? How can they find your podcast, and how can they buy the book?
Yeah, come hang out with me and learn about plants and how to cultivate more joy in your life. Bloom and Grow Radio on whatever podcast player you're currently listening to the show on. I'm Bloom and Grow Maria on socials, on TikTok and Instagram. And I would be so honored if people listening might consider buying Growing Joy, either on audiobook or, however books are sold, wherever books are sold, it's available. And it's, I like to say it's part self-care, part plant care, part memoir, mostly plant puns, but very, very similar to what we talked about today. And I promise you'll walk away after reading with at least one thing that you can immediately implement in your life to grow a little more joy.
What would basil do?
What would basil do? Also, limited edition collab t-shirts are available soon. We've got to get that t-shirt going.
The rubber band messages. Like what would
Yeah.
basil
Oh,
do?
like what would Jesus do?
Yeah.
What would basil do? I love that. That's so funny. I love that so much. But green instead of yellow, right?
Yes,
I love
absolutely.
that.
Maria, thank you so much for taking the time. This has been fantastic.
Yeah, it was really nice chatting with you.